Evening, everyone. Lovely to see so many of you here, young and old. So welcome as we dive into this passage here this evening. In today's passage, we see the ambitious disciples seeking glory in God's coming kingdom. But in Jesus' upside-down kingdom, he demonstrates the sacrificial path to glory, greatness in service. I wonder how you would define greatness. What would you have to do to be considered great? You probably haven't heard of Albert Schweitzer. If there's any Germans in the house, apologies for the pronunciation. He was born in 1875. The oldest son to a pastor in Germany. He studied theology. He was a very gifted organist. And he became ordained and became a world-renowned theologian. He wrote a famous book. He was an incredibly gifted person. And you might think he was well on his way to being great. But at the age of 30, he abruptly decided to change course in his life and became a mission doctor instead. He abandoned his mission field, his promising career rather, and went to medical school and became a doctor. And from there, in Africa, he built a hospital and a leper colony. And in 1952, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Now, Albert Schweitzer, he had many accomplishments, as you can read here. But what I think is really notable is that he discovered the wonderful gift of the Christian life, and that is that we are not called to be served, but to serve. And when we live with this desire to serve others, we find happiness and fulfillment that we don't get if we just look to be served. And Schweitzer, he summed this up in a famous quote of his, which was, "Every person I know who has been truly happy has learned how to serve others." Those who are truly happy are not spending their lives chilling on a beach, waiting for somebody to serve them a drink, lovely that might be. But to be truly happy and to have a meaningful life, they've worked out the secret of serving others. Life's not about seeking our own happiness and comfort. And as Schweitzer demonstrated, true happiness comes through serving others. I think this is a lesson that is really crucial and one that we all can be relearning about this evening. And it's at the heart of the passage that we've just read, or Josh just read. And we see that Jesus, he's very radical. He redefines greatness for us all, telling us that the path to true greatness lies in service. And he not only teaches this path, but he demonstrates it. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. So please do keep the passage open in front of you, and we'll be flicking through it and starting from verse 32. Mark resumes the journey that the disciples have been on with Jesus, and Jesus is walking ahead of them. And it's a vivid image, a picture of determination as he leads his disciples towards Jerusalem. Now, this is actually the first time in the Bible that Jerusalem is named as the destination where the disciples are going. It's a real turning point in Jesus' ministry. The disciples, they have a range of emotions. They follow astonished, it says. The crowd behind them, they're afraid. And their reaction, it captures the tension of the moment. Jesus moves forwards with resolute purpose. And with those of them who are following, they sense that something momentous is about to happen, something mysterious. In this scene, it describes a physical journey, but it also symbolizes discipleship itself. Mark here, he emphasizes that Jesus is on the way, and to know him is to follow him that same way, even if it leads to suffering. Here, Jesus is not only a teacher of humility and sacrifice, but he is the one who goes forwards in front of the disciples, showing the way that they must follow, the way they must walk. As the disciples watch Jesus stride ahead, they're filled with wonder, with awe. They believe that he's the Messiah, but they cannot reconcile the truth with the repeated predictions of his death. What is Jesus talking about here? They're confused and bewildered, and yet they continue to follow. Everything seems dark to them apart from this one thing. They love Jesus too deeply to let him go. In their uncertainty, they model a faith that clings to Christ even when they can't comprehend his ways. As we read on in verses 33 and 34, we have this amazing account that Jesus describes of his suffering and resurrection. It's the third one that we read in the Bible, the most detailed. And he tells them plainly he's going to be handed over, condemned, mocked, flogged, killed, after 3 days rise again. But this isn't a tragic accident or the enemy having a victory. This is the very purpose for which he came. As we read at the end of today's passage, verse 45, it is to give his life as a ransom for many. Throughout this chapter, Mark shows what true discipleship looks like. If you cast your eye further forward in the passage, at the beginning from verse 1, we have it dealing with how to live in areas like marriage. From verse 13, childlike trust. From verse 17, about our possessions. But now we come to a point where Jesus demonstrates that in order to follow him, we need to follow him down the path that he was walking. As we'll discover next week, not to spoil things too much, Bartimaeus, he demonstrates this really well in that being a disciple is not merely hearing Jesus' message, but it's to get up off your feet, to walk after him and follow him. So here then we see the heart of the Christian faith, following the Messiah who leads through suffering. Jesus walks ahead of us with unflinching resolve, calling us not simply to understand what he says, but to trust what he says, and to keep following even when the road looks decidedly dark. So we see in the remainder of our passage, if you keep looking at it, that the passage divides naturally into two sections. So from verse 35, we've got James and John who have this request of Jesus. And then from verse 41, we have Jesus' teaching on the true meaning of greatness in God's kingdom. But for now, though, we see that once again, the disciples managed to completely misunderstand Jesus' teaching about his coming suffering and mission. I've entitled this section, James and John, Grasping at Glory. That's a nice alliteration there for you. In verses 35 to 37, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, sons of thunder, they approach Jesus with this astonishing request. They ask him to do whatever we ask of you. And they seek the highest positions of honor. One at his right hand, one at his left hand, in his glory. And their timing is really striking. This request, it comes immediately after Jesus has given this really detailed account of how he's going to suffer, how he's going to die. And yet the disciples have this on their mind. The brothers still imagine that Jesus is on his way into Jerusalem to have this incredible, glorious enthronement. But their request, it exposes their deep misunderstanding that separates them from God's true mission, Jesus' true mission. Instead, they're showing all too human aspirations. The disciples, they appear to believe that greatness in God's kingdom is something they can reach out and grab. And maybe if we're honest, we find ourselves grappling for greatness. I think back of periods of my life, especially when I'm studying, and I love to study, but I also love to, have recognition for my achievements. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but is that the main thing? Maybe for you, have a think, like, what is it that you grasp at? Perhaps it's personal security through your earnings, your home, your possessions. Maybe it's also recognition for your successes, whether at school, whether in the workplace. Maybe it's popularity amongst our peers, either in person or online. When Jesus even asks James and John in verse 36, "What do you want me to do for you?" he reveals the disciples' true motives. It's a question that exposes, do they seek their personal glory or do they seek God's glory? In verse 37, James and John, they reveal both faith and folly. On the one hand, they're quite bold. They have a crest to sit at Jesus' right hand and his left hand in glory, and this shows that they do recognize him as the Messiah. They believe he is going to establish his kingdom. They just have a flawed view of what it means. They have faith in Jesus' power and his authority. And yet their ambition is also folly. It's full of foolishness. To be sat at Jesus' side means royal thrones, positions of highest honor. The brothers' desire is not merely to be with Jesus in his moments of triumph, but to secure for them prestige, status. And put yourself in the position of these other disciples. How would you feel? I'm sure you too would have shared in their indignation, as we read in verse 41. If we're honest, we'd probably be quite similar. And we too need to check our ambition. We're mostly Brits here, or people who are very familiar with British ways, and you'll know that we love our orderly queues. And I think maybe we see something similar here. James and John have jumped to the front of the queue, and the rest of the disciples, they don't like it. They're likely showing anger because they have jumped that queue. They've asked Jesus first what they want. The disciples, they demonstrate that they have the same desire for position and status, hoping for that prime position next to Jesus in honor. James and John, their motives are a mix of devotion and self-interest. Yes, they hope to honor Jesus, but they hope to do that while honoring themselves. It's a striking example of how easily worship and discipleship become tangled with one another. It continues a theme throughout Mark's gospel: human self-centeredness. This is highlighted time and again, and it stands in contrast to the humility and self-sacrifice that defines Jesus' true mission. I'm going to pause things there. We're going to have some questions. If you know me, in typical fashion, I have very long-winded questions that don't fit on the screen. I've tried to truncate them as much as possible. As ever, these are just for your guidance, so feel free to have any part of them. For those who are listening online, I'll read them out. I know you can read them here behind me. First of all, look at verse 32. Are there times when following Jesus feels scary, confusing, or costly for you? And what helps you to keep going? And then look at verse 36, this question that the disciples posed to Jesus. If Jesus asked you, what is it that you want? Then what would your honest answer be? Is it perhaps about your success, your glory, or is it about God's glory? So we'll spend a few minutes discussing that around our tables, and we'll come back in a few minutes.
No.
Okay, sorry to bring some of your conversations to a close. There will be more time to discuss later on. I hope that those conversations were helpful to put some of the passage into context in your own life. So next we see Jesus' response to the disciples' request. So if you turn with me to verse 38, here Jesus exposes how little the disciples understand what they're asking for. They seek honor, but Jesus instead points them to suffering. And he uses two vivid images here, one of the cup and one of baptism. And he explains that the path to glory in God's kingdom is not through grasping for power or glory, but through sharing in his suffering. Just to explain things a bit here, in biblical imagery, the cup, it represents what God allots to a person's life. So if you imagine at a royal banquet, a king hands the cup to somebody, it's a passing over, and it symbolizes the experiences that God allows, what he permits us to have. Sometimes it's of joy and blessing and great, but there are other times when it's suffering and judgment. So here, Jesus' mention of cup refers to the suffering and death that is awaiting him, but also those who are following him. These experiences being ordained by God himself. And then the image of baptism carries a similar meaning. Rather than referring to the ritual act, if you were here last week, you'd have experienced a great baptism service here. But rather than that, it symbolizes being overwhelmed. If you think of the expression baptism of fire, this gives a sense of being overwhelmed, like being plunged into waters deep full of grief, pain, and death. Jesus is asking, can you face being submerged with the hatred and suffering as I will be? To be forcibly forced underneath the waters, cast into the depths. So here, both the cup and the baptism, they remind us that Jesus means sharing a path of sacrifice. He's teaching that the road to greatness in God's kingdom leads us through the cross. In verse 39, Jesus tells James and John that they will indeed drink the cup and undergo the baptism that he speaks of, but not quite in the same way that Jesus will. Jesus has a unique mission that follows God's plan of redemption. For the disciples, this cup and baptism describe their future path of persecution, of hardship that came from following him. You'll recall that these disciples, most of them died as a result of following Jesus. In verse 40, Jesus states that to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom they have been prepared. And this reminds us that God's purpose won't fail. But however, it can't be understood in advance. The disciples, they're not called to follow Jesus because they know what lies ahead and what they'll gain, but simply because he leads that way. And the right path is always the path that Jesus leads us on, the one that means that we follow him. If you think of greatness in leadership, I wonder what you think in our society. You might think of authority that's exerted by a boss, or maybe a teacher, or maybe the rank of an officer in the forces. You might look to think more digitally, the number of followers you have on social media, that's a form of authority. And the world, it prizes the power and prestige that you have, or supposedly have, through these positions. But Jesus overturns these societal expectations by teaching that greatness is marked instead by humility, by service. And this marks our second section, which I've entitled Jesus' Kingdom, Greatness in Service. Jesus has exposed the disciples' misunderstanding of leadership. If you read with me in verses 43 to 44, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Greatness in God's kingdom, according to this verse, is measured by how one serves others, not by how much power one holds. In God's eyes, the highest calling is not power, not even freedom, but love expressed through service. Inward-looking ambition is self-seeking and is therefore not love. Or maybe it's love for self, but it's not love for others. Love, instead, by its nature, it looks outward to other people. So true discipleship means belonging to others in humble service. If you consider those of us who stand on stage, small stages, bigger stages, those who preach, those who teach, and those who lead services, like, you don't sit here in the congregation in order to benefit us. Rather, the church's leaders exist to serve you. We exist for the sake of the church. So the leader, the person who follows Christ, doesn't rule over the community that they're in, but instead serves within it. There should be a real challenge to our thinking. Instead of asking, what can others do for me? Or what service can I extract? Instead, Jesus invites us to serve others, to seek opportunities to give to others, for Jesus has given us much. Following Jesus, it's not an exercise in seeking status or privilege, but it's to follow his example, the servant who gave himself completely for others. And so we come to our final verse, to verse 45. And here Jesus summarizes the heart of his mission and the model for all disciples. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This ransom, it speaks of the price that is paid to set somebody free. And it's a familiar image in the Jewish and Roman culture of which our passage is set. And it's used to speak of redeeming slaves or prisoners. So Jesus himself was that ransom, is that ransom, giving his life to free humanity from sin and from death. But this verse is not just about Jesus, about what he did for us. It also reveals how his disciples are meant to live. This ransom, it's unique to Christ, to his ministry, his calling. But the spirit behind it, that of humble service, self-sacrifice, and care for others before oneself, that's what every disciple should look to imitate. Greatness in God's kingdom comes through not power, not through privilege, but through giving, through serving, just as Jesus did. So to be a true disciple of Jesus, and I hope here tonight you are yearning for that. If not, then I hope Jesus is painted in a picture where you really would love to follow and look to him. To be this disciple, it's not about gaining status, it's not about security, but it's about following the way of the cross, self-denying, self-giving service for the sake of others. At the heart of all Christian service stands this crucified and risen Lord who freed us so that we might serve the world in love. Following this example of Jesus, we can become great, not for our own sake, but for others. Be great for serving others. Look for opportunities to give to others as Jesus has given to us. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. He invites us all to follow him and do the same, to the glory of God. So the second set of questions around our tables. I couldn't I couldn't go to 2 questions, so I thought, I'll throw 3 in there just in case you want some bonus ones. I've conveniently put a little star by it so you can work out where they are because we couldn't quite fit it in. But I hope you do benefit from discussing this around your tables. And remember, there is more time after the service if you need to. So hope it's helpful.